Blademaster. The Northern Void. J.T. Williams. Copyright 2024 by J.T. Williams. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. Let go of the past so you may see beyond the shrouds and unto starlight once again. Contents. Prologue. I, Sacred Urlas. Sku Night Terrors. Part 3. Exodus. Thur, Lord of Blackhall. IV. The White Plains. V. Voidgate. Seeks Thrashing. C7. Blademaster. Epilogue. Prologue. I am alone. As he slid in viscous, pulled blood, breaking up the snow and ice beneath his feet, he made for the high ground ahead of him. He had to be nearly to the beaches. The wind and speckles of ice flew around him in a swirl as he heard a shriek. He swung upward with his sword. Nothing. He stopped to catch his breath, his head pivoting left and right as he checked another one for any signs of life. He pressed his fingers against the Archon's neck. Another dead. They're all dead. Above, a long and slender black shroud reached down as the polar lights began to ripple high above. The elf fled the spot he was in, knowing if he dwelt too long, the shroud would grasp him. You mustn't run aimlessly. I see you. I can help, a voice said. No, Wura cannot help in the realm of Vanku, the very god of death who came against Urlas. 3 black beasts formed before him. Their bodies were like black fire, and their eyes a fierce red like bright burning flames. I am Rooks, the elf shouted, Swordmaster of Urlas, and I will be your bane. He brought his Urlas blade forward, lunging as he swung up, slashing through the first foe. He felt the others move in the winds as they twisted around him. Rooks countered, bringing his sword up into a mid-guard and spinning, striking both. Their eviscerated forms fell with a crackling sear upon the snow, before becoming as every other being upon the icy tundra, frigid. Cursed path! All who left Urlas have been cursed to this fate. I told them all, Rooks shouted. I cannot escape this place. But another voice was in his head, a voice that he had not heard in such a way before. Then, he felt the necklace about his neck begin to vibrate. No, Rooks, no. Make for the sea, a ship. The sea shall save you. Urlas still needs its Blademaster. He looked down at the necklace swinging from his neck and saw it was glowing. He had found this back in Urlas before they had departed for the north. Urlas calls you home, the voice said. Part 1. Sacred Urlas. 3 days earlier. The trees of Urlas reached high into the blue sky. Rooks sat cross-legged upon the ground as he closed his eyes. He could smell the flowers blossoming near the edge of the woods, and a cricket on a nearby tree sang its song. The gravel surrounding him was still, and most importantly, silent. He inhaled, held the breath, then exhaled. Still silence surrounded him. Then, after 2 more breaths, he could hear the gravel to his left scratch one pebble against another ever so lightly. A moment later, he reached for his blade and pushed off the ground. Rooks took to the air as his pupil passed beneath him in a full lunge. He brought his blade down and broke the elf's guard before returning his blade to its sheath. The elf was still moving in the direction of his initial attack before he fell forward, his sword sliding a distance away from him. You were too loud, Rooks said. You also overcommitted in the attack, allowing me to barely strike your guard and take you from your feet. The elf struggled to catch his breath. Pushing off the ground, he reclaimed his sword. Rooks stood with his arms crossed. But master, if I do not commit to the attack with full vigor, will I not risk losing passion in my advance? I must show in action and technique that I am not wavering in my stance or intent. Rooks nodded once. Commitment in the forward motion, yes, but you had no plan for if your advance failed. In this exercise, you were meant to learn and relearn that very thing. As we discussed yesterday, it is why Urlas does not go after war in any path, but instead we let our enemy make the first advance. A guarded stance into a counter? The elf asked. Yes, Rook said. Your opponent will rarely feint in their first move. It is in this that we can counter and move into any number of our own feints. Come, Silas, let us get some water. They went to Rooks's forge, and Silas sat down at the table on the outside porch. Rooks had taught many students, and it was always after lessons he would allow them to decompress and think of the day's training. Many Urlas blades had passed under his tutelage, but in this case, this student was different. He was one of the many orphans who had lost his parents a few years ago. While elves were immortal, they still typically remained with their parents for their first 1,000 years of life. At least, that was how high elves of Urlas were. When the banner ships with the bodies of many elves had returned from the wars in Taria, Rooks had been stricken with a grief unlike any he had ever felt. While death in the practice of war was expected, the scale of loss was not. Urlas had never recovered from the thousands lost, and now Urlas itself was a fracture of the strength it once had been. You're thinking of them again, Silas said. I am. Rooks nodded. Memories remain even if they challenge us from time to time. Do you wish you had been beside them? Rooks looked at his student. My place was to teach them so that I was not required beside them. But if you ask as a brother in arms, yes, I would defend every one of you. In fact, I doubt there would be the same Blademaster here in Urlas if I could have been beside the fallen, for I would lay down my life without question for each of you. For death and glory, Master. For death in sacrifice, for the love of each of you. Rooks nodded as Silas drew out his sword. The Urlas blade flashed red as he set it on the table and took out an enchanting stone. I finished the second part of the enchantment. Rook snickered. I still can't believe Master Orr convinced me to let one of my students put spell inscriptions on their blades. Wasn't it because of the ones who left? Rooks's thoughts went to the blade he'd found on the shore of Urlas. Yes, he said. And you can say his name, Silas. Kalak was the youngest, yes? Rooks nodded. He was. We found that blade. After Master Archon was able to distill the memory, we saw our warriors go down fighting Itsu demons. These spells will protect us from those, Silas said, just as the Archons now have bladed weapons. Urlas will remain no matter our enemy, Rook said, no matter our enemy. His student returned to High Urlas, the capital city. Rooks walked through the woods alone to the river's edge. This was the one place he could still find solace and keep it. The blade of the youngest of the family, who had departed Urlas years ago, had washed ashore. Its wielder was Kalak. His sister was an Archon in training named Alri, and his oldest brother was near the trials to become an ordained blade. Then there was Keelan, the most obstinate and argumentative student he had ever had, second only to his own best friend, Jalin, the children's father. Oh, how I failed all of you. He bowed to the sword as it sat on the altar of polished ruinite ore. While he felt much guilt, the loss of so many was compounded by the loss of Jalin and his family. I thought I told you to come to me, a voice said. Rook said, glancing behind him. My good Archon, I said I would come to you if I was near breaking. A bit of sadness always haunts me. As it does for all of us. Rooks turned to see Master Orr. Starlight shines above, and yet a darkness is upon us still, he said. Rook stood up. You still regret allowing them to leave? Kalak was the youngest. And yet he fought just the same, even with a blink of training compared to the rest. Still, I should have stopped them. They began to walk along the shore of the river together. The glowing flowers of Ilril roots, a native flower to Urlas alone, sent up small, crystalline pollen. And by stopping them, you may have preserved their lives but further drove them to act in another way. You know that I still feel they live in some form. Living in some form is not the same as living, Master Or. They stopped, and Or put his arm on Rook's. And Master Rooks, he said, emphasizing his title, you train your blades to face death, do you not? They stared at one another for a few moments. Rooks took a deep breath. I was not seeking you tonight just to speak of such things. There are whispers that must be spoken aloud before the council. Whispers? He has emerged once again. I have no time for the shaman's ramblings. He saw the fall of warriors in Taria, and he told us that the Itsu came against Kaelin, Alri, Taslun, and Kalak before I had done the reversal spell on the sword. Just because the High Council trusts him and sees him to be a near deity doesn't mean I do, and I know you don't, he said, pointing at him. Still, it is cause for concern. We meet at Moon Peak tonight. Rooks looked up and knew that was only in about an hour. Okay, let us go then. The two of them made their way to the High City, passing into the White Gates and down the long, massive wooden trees that lay from Lake Tracine all the way to the Council Tower. While the city did not have near what it had before in terms of their kin, the grandeur of Urlas had not darkened. As an ancient city founded by those loyal to Dwemhar of old, Urlas was an endearing symbol of the old world made in a fashion that elves no longer had. None save the city of Narisond was as old, for even the destroyed city of Saelmark was but a Dwemhar city turned elven, not an elven city. They passed through to the council chambers at the peak of the tower itself in High Urlas to see the assembled elves and the one Rooks considered the abomination of Urlas, the shaman Iuir. In his own opinion, it was because of this shaman's rambles so many had fallen, but the shaman was older than any elf, and many amongst Urlas believed him to be a god of sorts, though the shaman did not consider himself such. In fact, to any who tried to think of where the shaman began or perceive anything of the like, even Rooks could not actually think of where he had come from. He had just been, and it was understood as such. But instead of this leading to questioning, Urlas had lost some of its zeal for the old gods to, in many ways, deify this man as a form of god. This did not sit well with Rooks or Oar. We are called to council this night, Master Elor said aloud. The High Council of Urlas was made up of Master Blades and the one Master Archon, Oor. Rooks was on the council, of course, but the many seats that once made up those who decided the actions of Urlas had been left empty. Once the council had been at over 300, at least 10 for every house of Urlas, but now the houses were all but broken. Now, those who remained were gathered and filled only 6 seats. Master Ilor, a blade trained before Rooks's tenure, stood up. I have gathered you here due to the haste and falling darkness upon us. Our guest Iuir has seen a vision, and we are called to action. What has the shaman seen? Another asked. This was Master Del, a student who had been under Rooks. In fact, he, Truor, Ulgin, and Iliasa had all been his students. While normally they would not hold the positions they did, the loss of life had been so severe that it was necessary. There is a growing darkness in the far north of the glacial seas. Upon a tundra, on an island with no name formed by the great ice flows, a void gate opens. A void gate? Or asked. They have been closed since the time of the Dwemhar. It seems that the world has been shaken enough that such is our fate. A necromantic power grows in the far south of our lands, a power unmatched thus far. The imbalance has allowed whatever hold the old locks had to loosen. Necromancers are everywhere, Truor said. What difference does one more make? She is of the Dwemhar bloodline, Shaman Iuir said. Dwemhar? Or asked. The necromancer is not a concern to us, Iuir said. I call you to act as Blades of Urlas, the sacred guardians. Long have you been safe as a people in the far north. Your loyalty to Iaclo, Elio, and the Dwemhar who came before has secured your position. We have hardly been safe, Eliasa said. Countless of our brethren have fallen in wars of no regard to us. Your brother's death still is upon you, Iowir said. I understand, but we must act. Act? Rooks asked. I have called for the shipwrights to make ready the remnants of the fleet, Elor said. We shall set sail with our forces and go to where the shaman has directed. We will close the Void Gate. Close the Void Gate? Oar asked. I can't even get to them and you expect to close them? These aren't some iron dwarf gates we can just see. The Void Gates are ethereal. They require power beyond understanding to even get to, and that's only what I know from the stories. They require crystals of Iaclo, Ywir said, assembled in concentric circles in a place that exists at the very tundra where darkness has descended. And you have these? Rooks asked. Ywir nodded and pointed to Ilor. The shaman, in his infinite wisdom and power, has blessed us with these. Elor pulled out a simple wooden box. He opened it, and the most dazzling light shined forth from 3 bright blue crystals. We must leave at first light, Elor said. It has to be agreed, Or said. It has to be voted on. Any action of war from Urlas must be voted upon. This is not war, Elor said, and the shaman has spoken. Do you not understand? Blade, I'm one of a handful of remaining archons in Urlas and a master upon this council. You wish to send what little forces we have for the defense of Urlas to the north on a whim because this shaman says so? He shouted, pointing at Ywir. Elor stood, his face red when Ywir raised his hand. I am and always have been a guest within your sacred land, Ywir said. I do not wish for Urlas to go against its creed. A vote is necessary, and I agree. Your forces are less than 1,000 blades. Please, he bowed. Please vote as is your custom. Who would dare vote against this? Elor said. Just let us vote, Ulgan said. We must act in agreeance. Fine, Elor said. Urlas must go north to secure the Void Gate. Raise hands in agreeance. Rooks looked about the room. Elor was the first to raise his hand. Eliasa crossed his arms. No, I cannot support this. Rooks had spoken with him many times about the loss of his brother, and it seemed the Blade did not wish to go to war or risk more life. Del, however, did raise his hand and was one of the first. The next was Ulgan. Rooks looked to Or, who crossed his arms and looked down. He was abstaining. In the case of abstaining, a master would not be denying the need, but was unsure of the method of action being voted on. This, too, was Rooks's own stance. The vote has failed, Elor said. Tell me, Eliasa, do you hate Urlas? And Master Rooks and Or, you too fail to understand? I would expect you both to understand need. After all, you sent children from Urlas to face a darkness of their own. Or stood, energy flowing from his body into his staff. Master Rooks stood up with him. To bring up the fallen here in such a way is not a path you wish to take, Master Elor, Rooks stated. He looked to our, not the place. Save it for our enemy. Silence befell the council. Shaman Ywir stood. I believe peaceful meditation and sleep is necessary, he said. We shall put off departure and reconvene. Perhaps then the vote can be truer. Eliasa stood up. I will not change my vote on this. I have seen far too many depart these shores and fall for no reason that makes sense in my mind. I speak for more than just my brother, too. I will not draw my blade from the simple ramblings of a madman. Do you not see the look he has even now as he sits here on our sacred council? Rooks looked over at the dark eyes staring out from the hooded shaman. You cannot deny it. Rest, Elor said. You will not insult our guest. I will rest and we can return and vote, but I will not fight for some madman. Urlas is safe. The children and people that remain here are safe. Our border has not been broken, and I would rather us be as we have been and not at war with the supposed darkness in the north. Our people deserve to live within Urlas. I will not commit our sons and daughters to more war. I have spoken. Eliasa stormed out of the council chambers. Oaur went to follow him. As the council stood one by one, Master Elor came to Rooks. "You understand. You can talk to your friend," he said. Rooks nodded. "There has been much loss, and the shaman risks nothing by sending others to do his work. Always the same with him and his visions." "I am going," the shaman said. Rooks glared over at him. "What?" "I am going. I will not have you face this enemy alone. But if I can inspire the elves of Urlas, I will. Tell your friend and the one who says no. Perhaps that will be enough. If it is, come back, tell me. Otherwise, I fear what waiting longer will bring, but I will not force the hand of Urlas where it does not desire to go of its own free will." Such was the same when I told the children brought up before, of Keelan, Alri, and the others. I will not force others to do something. "Go to them," Ilor said. "I trust you can do this." Part 2. Night Terrors. Rooks didn't like this. He departed the council and followed after Oor and Eliasa, finding them near the gates of High Urlas, but still they did not stop. Eliasa was frantic all the way to Lake Tracine. Rooks struggled to keep up until at last they sat beside the starlit water. "They are mad. I know I am the youngest on the council, and all would rather have my brother," Eliasa said. "But the shaman has never had such a prominent place, and yet our numbers are fewer and fewer." "I understand your fear," Oor said. "But you do not join me in voting, no?" Oor noticed Rooks approaching. "And you?" Eliasa asked, looking at him. "Every day you grieve decisions you've made. I know that." Rooks nodded slowly. "I do, Master Eliasa, and I too have reservations. Urlas is one of the oldest cities of high elves in the living realm, but it was our loyalty to the Dwemhar that originally sustained us." "There are no Dwemhar," Eliasa said. "This is a shaman, and no one even knows where he came from." Rooks went to speak, but did not. "You see, you know it to be true." "I can say something," Oor said. "I have sought through our histories and our own living memory. It is why I have been able to distill pure memory from objects like Calic's sword. In the case of my spells, that was easy. But I have tried the same on bones from within my own training grounds and have found that something disturbs my practice." "Disturbs?" Rooks asked. "It is like I can see the distillation take form, but it disintegrates before me and the memory is lost." "And you think this is what?" "Manipulation. Manipulation of memory. Who would want to hide something from us?" Our remained silent, but shook his head. "Such a thought flees my mind," the Archon said. "The shaman?" Rooks asked. "He's always one to tell others to go about the land, never himself." "Never." Rooks sighed. "Well, then perhaps some bit of guidance I can offer now. He is going. He goes north with us." "What?" Oor asked. "I heard him say it. So if you will agree to a yes, we are to return to the council chambers and make ready for our exodus." Our looked away and then down. Eliasa stared out over the water. "I still remember, Rooks. I remember the look my brother gave me when he left for Taria. He swore it would be okay. He wasn't even supposed to be in a war. They were pulled into it as it started. Then he died in defense of Sailmark." "I haven't forgotten it," Rooks said. "I woke up one night hearing his voice, hearing him jeer at his enemy of my teachings. His enemy told him to flee. He was telling them that his master wouldn't like that very much." Eliasa laughed. "No, you wouldn't." He took a deep breath and shook his head. "I will sleep on these words and thoughts. I cannot make a decision, but my heart still says no. I do not believe that will change." Or stood up. Sleep is good. In dreams our minds can restore and reignite for a better day tomorrow. I depart as well. We will speak tomorrow, Eliasa, Rook said. Oor and Rooks left him beside Lake Thrashing. They journeyed around the shore as Oor began toward his own home via the portal rocks. He isn't going to change his mind, and I do not blame him, Oor said. No, I don't think he will, Rook said. But I will speak to him first thing. Try to convince him. The simple truth that the shaman is going with us is enough to compel us in my mind. I almost wish I would have said no then. I am surrounded by a fog of confusion, the Archon said. I never wished to make a decision such as this in such a state, but... He looked down. Confusion has grasped me for years. Rooks looked into his friend's eyes. You do think there is some level of intentional delusion-making? I do. A madness, Oor said. But all the same, I will not let more of our kin fall without me beside them. If the void gates open, there are no Dwemhar to fight them back. Itsu demons have attempted to breach our world before. The children fought them, so part of me screams that there is no choice but to embrace our Urlas blood. He sighed. Perhaps it is poetic that we must fight them now too. I seek what solace I may find there, as can you. Rooks watched as Oor accessed the portal rocks and was gone. Now, the sounds of the wind and the water lapping the shore were his only companions. He looked up at the crescent moon high above and a shroud of clouds floating high above their island. So long has Urlas remained. We stayed loyal to the ancient Dwemhar, fought against their enemies, and earned this place in the world, yet have never backed down when called to help others. But so many have been lost. He looked around and watched as fairies floated in the boughs of green leaves. Beyond the trees, the sparkling stars were like looking into the past as he saw in his mind the high elves of old waking now eons ago in the history of the world. The void gates were celestial passageways in the old lore. As he understood them, they were passageways between the sealed realms to that of the living realms, and for the longest time were protected by Dwemhar Templars and Rusis even. The heroes and heroines of old had many names, but Riakar was the one most present in his own mind. Keelan, you always mentioned that one. In your end, you fought as he would have. The loss of them overtook him, and his eyes welled with tears. He stomped the ground, and then noticed a distant rumbling. He jerked his glance around and felt it again. The water before him trembled, the lapping waves disrupted. Several white flashes split off over the lake before it, blinding him for a moment. The trees where they landed burst into flames. Shattering sounded above him, like many pieces of glass falling from the sky. The ward above Urlas broke. Fire rained down as now many more white flashes fell upon the woods, igniting fires. Elven horns sounded. There were several bright blue flashes across the lake. It was there that Master Oor had gone. Oor! Rooks went to the portal rocks. He pressed the stones, and there was spark, then nothing. The rocks would not activate. More blue flashes overtook the Archon training grounds, followed by blasts of white light. Even from afar, Rooks could see multiple glowing bodies flying upward into the sky as the Archon defended himself. More horns sounded, and then went silent. Rooks drew his blade, sprinting around the edge of Lake Thrashing. Then he was struck. More flashes of white flung into the ground near him, throwing him up mid-run, and he spun into the air. He struck the ground, rolling several more times before he came to rest against one of the great trees. He looked up and around. Nothing was near him, but he saw upon the center of the lake a single shrouded figure. Then green fire flung upward, and like bolts of lightning, spells struck the grounds all around him and across Urlas. Rooks staggered toward his blade as his leg was bleeding profusely from the attack, and he hadn't even realized it. As he reclaimed his weapon, two fairies flew down to him. In a dance of twisting and fluttering up and down his body, he was restored. 3 white forms appeared on the shore of the lake. He slid his right foot back behind him and lifted his sword. "In the name of High Urlas, flee these lands or embrace the fate of those who would raise weapons against the blades of Urlas." The figures drew their weapons, each holding long spears of dazzling white light. In a squealing tone like a horn, one of them spoke. "Vanku does not care of the realms of the living." "Vanku, then the god of death has sent his forms upon the realm." Rooks lunged, slashing upward before parrying a spear to his right and then left, kicking the form and nearly staggering as it was ethereal in nature. 4 more forms appeared, each glowing in a bright white light. They were not foes he had heard of serving Vanku, but alone he would fight them. His ruinite blade, hand-forged by him and burning bright in the midnight hour of darkness and death within Urlas, sang its song. He landed a hit, severing one of his foes' heads. He followed through, spinning about and kicking up to use his momentum to strike another coming behind him. It brought its weapon up in a guard. He ignored the guard, breaking the weapon and cutting down nearly the entire form of the being. 4 more upon him now, he slid, spinning several times and summoning forward a wall of fire formed from his sword. He ignited the air, blasting them back before he saw several more forms appearing. He had taken down 4, yet now more than 12 had come. He reached at his belt, a little trick he kept for his students that would serve him well enough here. "Serve me, distract." He cast dust on the ground, forming up his own allies of spectral warriors. They engaged his attackers, unable to kill them, as they were nothing but a spell. But Rooks's foes didn't know this. Several of the attackers were distracted, and Rooks took advantage of this to go after each of them. Parrying the ones going for him, he took advantage of each chance. In flashes of fire and shimmering slashes into the ethereal foes, he managed to take down one after another. His allies were figured out and dispelled by the attackers that remained, but by that time, Rooks was on the final 2. Then 1. Then, in a finalizing jump thrust, he defeated the last of them. Now, more horns sounded across Urlas. Fire erupted in the mountains north of Urlas, in the domain of Shaman Iwir himself. Rooks went to hurry that direction when from across Lake Thrashing came the figure he had seen before. Now, the ground rumbled beneath his feet, and clawed hands ripped the soil, reaching out. The figure reached the shore, and death was upon his bony arms as maggots fell onto the green grass of the lake shore, igniting it in a black fire. With a hiss, it spoke. "Urlas is no longer protected. My master is powerful and weaves all. You will do as they command." Rooks lifted his blade. "Urlas does not follow any of your ilk." Now other elves had arrived, including Master Eilor and one of Rooks's apprentices, Silas. "Master, we are here!" The figures beneath the ground burst from the soil. "Undead!" Master Elor shouted. Then, like a burning flame, and in an explosion of sundering dirt, Oar slammed into the ground just beside the figure, sending a purging spell across the shore. The spell shriveled the undead near them. In a single motion, he dragged the figure down into the rocks of the shore with grappling spells and held it there. "Bane of Vanku, curse of the old world," the Archon shouted. "Drown in our sacred waters and rid yourself of your wretchedness." Their foe shook and tore at the bindings, but Oor cast more. "Master Archon," Elor said, "we should question it." The figure ceased its fight, and the Archon lifted the form out of the water, grasping it by its face, which was nothing more than a bony, lifeless, and dripping caricature of some elf or man. "No need," Oor said, pulling out a dagger. He severed what tissues remained in the decaying neck and then draped the skull with twine from his staff. From there, a long and slender silver string appeared, going out of Urlas and to the north. "Our foe comes from the place where we have discussed going, and Urlas is no longer safe. I think we should all be in agreement now that, regardless of differences of opinion, we must act." "What were these?" Silas asked. "Itsu beings, at least the glowing ones. They are a fraction of the foe that could come. The others were necromancer thralls, but they were easily dispatched. This, a necromancer but one of limited power." "Where did the dead come from?" Elor asked. "I do not know for certain, but that is not the matter at the moment. We must tend to our wounded." There was another explosion of flame in the mountains. "Shaman Iowir," Rook said. "There are injured in the city too, Master Archon. I will tend to the injured and work with others to purge any of the undead mist." "I will go to Iowir." Dozens of blades had come now, and Rooks looked at each of them. "Come now, and you," he said, looking to Silas. "You too. Part 3. Exodus. The path going up from the lower valley of Urlas to the shaman's hovel was a stairwell built into the mountains beside a roaring waterfall. The way, taken by many of the elves of Urlas for one reason or another, felt different this time. There was a solemn feeling in the air and amongst the ascending blades. Rooks was on point, with the burning blades of many blades behind him. He scanned the stairs above, and in the shadows of dwindling fire from the attack, he pointed at 2 below him. One was Silas. The other was an elf by the name of Nari. "Come with me. We sprint up the stairs and check outside the hovel. The rest of you come quickly after, but keep watch behind every boulder and beyond." His eyes glanced up. "Urlas is not the safe haven it once was. Our enemy could return at any moment." Rooks and Silas, as well as Nari, made their fast advance. As they crested the hill, Silas went right and Nari left. Rooks approached the hovel and hopped up to the top of it. He scanned their surroundings from the higher vantage point. Everything was burned, save the hovel itself. The other blades moved up the stairs and surrounded the hovel. Rooks made his way back down to the doorway and peered beyond the fluttering cloth curtain hanging in the entrance. The ground was charred, but the structure remained. He brought his blade up, and followed by his kin, he entered the hovel. It was empty. What happened to him? They began to check the surrounding area to look for his body, but no body was found. There was a large amount of ash surrounding the hovel itself from all the fires. "Keep watch," he said to the others. Silas and he went back into the hovel, and for the first time ever, he went through the shaman's items. Most were strange trinkets, roots, and stones. Nothing seemed to make any sense at all, and boxes of colored shells were the last thing he was looking for. Now he found a single trunk beside an upturned bed, where he assumed the shaman had been lying when the attack began. He opened the trunk to see stacked parchments and a strange medallion. Rooks lifted it, and it began to glow before fading. "Symbol of High Urlas," Silas said. The apprentice was right. "Perhaps from the original founding of Urlas," Rooks said. "A gift from the High Elves to Iowir." "Were those not the necklaces the original council had?" Rooks nodded. "I believe so. But Iowir is not High Elf." "He was there at the beginning," Rooks said, closing the box but still clutching the necklace. "And I fear he may have been there for our end." "End?" Silas asked. Rooks sighed. "Urlas's protection is gone. Our enemy is a greater enemy than any we have seen in our lifetimes, and in truth was the enemy of our forebears and beyond, an eternal fiend." Silas knelt. "I am prepared, Master, prepared to do the will of the Urlas High Guard." "Stand, Silas." The elf stood, and Rooks looked him in the eyes. "If you are of Urlas, you are now of its guard. Every elf, be their creed, be that of blade, archon, or neither, must protect our home." "Master! Master!" a voice shouted from outside. Silas and Rooks quickly went to the sounds to find one of the blades holding a charred body wearing the garb of the shaman. "Iowir," one of them said. "We found him near the falls. He was surrounded by white ash and broken candles." The head was nearly indistinguishable, but the garb and the build matched that of their ancient friend. "Are we sure, though? Are we sure?" one of them asked. "What tragedy has befallen Urlas?" Rook sighed. "Much. Before, we believed ourselves safe. Now, our wise friend and teacher has fallen. Though it pains me, I can see no other truth but it being as we see it. He is dead." They left him where he was laid before the door of the hovel. "We must tend to his body," a blade said. "We leave it here, as this was his home," Rook said. "But take it in, cover the body. We will make a choice as to how to handle him with the others of Urlas. For now, he will rest here." While Rook's decision didn't align with what they all wanted, they for now settled on covering him with a blanket within the hovel and weighing it down with some of the nearby rocks. It was enough for now, but in time, Rooks knew they'd do more. They returned to High Urlas to find the dead brought before Lake Thrashing. Among the dead lay Iliasa, and with him were dozens of other high elves. They came upon them as if they were specters of white, floating ethereal beings with black fire as their weapon, Elor said. "They are an enemy not of our world, and as such I must ask those remaining who were undecided if Urlas will meet this enemy or if we will wait for them to come to us again." "We go," Orr said, standing beside Rooks. Rooks nodded. "Yes." A call was put out to all of High Urlas for any and every person to grab a weapon. Most already had them. But as hundreds now stood before the city gates, Master Ilor made a loud proclamation. "Tragedy has befallen us once again. We will grieve the loss of our brethren, but will do so with swords ringing and upon the field of battle. Our enemy awaits us in the cold, icy northern glacial seas. Master Orr has found the source of our attack, and we will deploy our blades and archons immediately to silence this enemy. We are descendants of the high elves of Urlas of before, in the time before the seas, when the light of the Dwemhar shone upon all. As children, we heard stories of the many heroes of old, and as parents ourselves, we told the stories to our children. It was the blades who fought beside Dwemhar Templars, not elves of Narisond or occupiers of the Varmark woodlands near Taria, not the dwarves of Harodar or the other ancient cities, not the race of men even when their own high city was lit with the torch of Vazruda. Urlas is the last line before the rest of the world, and I will lead us to the northern void gate and not only seek revenge for those before you, but secure our border against our enemy." The crowd did not clap or cheer. A solemn dread filled the air. Rooks knew what the decision meant, as most who remained would be the last of Urlas. They had but a few hundred blades with experience, and those beyond that were the orphans from the Taria Wars. Still, they were ordained. Now the many ships of Urlas were prepared upon Lake Thrashing, carried out from their resting places in the woods, and stocked with everything that would be needed for the journey. As the blades prepared, Rooks took all his apprentices to the shoreline on the northern part of the lake. Now, standing before them as they were assembled and wearing the armor of their people, he drew out and lifted his ruinite blade. The sunrise was behind him, and the morning stars bore witness to his words. "Urlas calls all to stand in this late hour. You have trained to be blades of Urlas, and while no trial has yet been held, you stand in the kindling of the only fire that awaits. Urlas goes to war, and perhaps it will be our final one. Kneel, each of you." The assembled elves knelt as Rooks continued. "From the ocean high to the ocean low, Urlas remains. From moonrise to starfall, Urlas remains. With every sonnet upon solemn seas of moonlit realms and maidens eternal, it is but by blades of Urlas, we and our people remain. Arise, blades of Urlas, hearken forth, and fear not death, but only the death that does not come from honor sought. Seek not its embrace with blade in sheath, but welcome it with ruinite fire burning brightly in hand." The elves stood. Rooks looked over each of them. Most were under 400 years old, and by reckoning of men or even dwarves, they were older. But in the realm of Urlas, they were still children. I will be beside each of you. Do not fear. Now the blades of Urlas boarded their ships, and with them archons from the city dispersed to each ship. Oar and Rooks stood on the docks beside one another as the 20 vessels to head north were nearly ready. I have looked toward every tome of knowledge in the past hour, Oar said. You are a quick study, then, Rooks teased. Oar laughed. I cannot see the source of our enemy, for even as they came at us and have looked and seen what came against Alri, Keelan, Kalak, and Taslun, they are not the same. Rooks looked at him. Surely the enemy from the void would be the same. The Itsu have always sought to enter our world. I do not sense that, as I keep hold of this. The bound necromancer's head hung from our staff, looking just as it had hours ago. I sense something, but I cannot place it, Rooks, Orr told him, a sense of fear in his voice. We will deal with it regardless, Rooks said. By the light of Urlas, stars watch over us. O'Aur nodded. Horns sounded from high Urlas, and ferries floated beside the ships as the fleet departed through the eastern passage and away from Urlas. Rook stood aboard his ship, with Silas standing nearby. As they passed through the mountains and toward open sea, Rooks looked back at the city and the massive trees. I pray I look upon you again, with not dread, but happiness in my heart. Yet, if it is fate that I never see this place again, may my end bring about the protection of my sacred home forever. Part 3. Lord of Blackhall. Upon the glacial seas so dark, the polar night holds sway, and even with 1,000 fires the darkness will forever stay. Twilight cold and whispering winds. In olden times we dwelt, where warriors of many creeds, before in honor of many, knelt. The glacial seas this time of year were always dark, while the sun of the Urlas realm would have risen as if Urlas was in the world before. Now the sun matched the realms beyond Urlas. The cold cut through them, and the green lights of Wura high in the sky danced almost as if to guide their journey. Rooks could see our ship at the head of the fleet, as he was the one to guide them to their destination. Within a few hours the sky had cleared, and the sun that had been trekking along the horizon had gone down. Thankfully, the seas were calm, and stars reached out in an ever-expanding jeweled sky. Silas was cupping a mug of tea. While many slept below decks, he and others were in amazement of the sky. Though those of Urlas had always seen their own sky, Urlas was a place almost separate from the rest of the world. The sky was even a bit different, or, in a way, clearer than the elves had ever seen. Rook stared out across rolling waves as Silas nudged him. "Tea, master?" Rooks took it and smiled. "I wonder if this is how Keelan and Kalak felt," he said. "They had to have seen these same skies." "Yes, I'm sure they did," Rook said, "but I can say for sure this is how they felt. You spent time with Kalak, didn't you?" Silas nodded. "We worked on our dueling together. He always told me that he wanted to be like Taslin. We tried to get Keelan to work with us, but he always cheated. He was always grabbing a second sword. I'm not sure I would call it cheating, but his technique was not traditional in our time. If you go back to Dwemhar Templars and ancient blades, it was known. Our swords used to be a bit shorter back then, too. A handful of blades learned to dance upon their blades, a skill I do not know at all. With our longer blades, it might even make a bit more sense, but I heard stories from my master of how warriors would run at opponents and then hop upon their blade before striking. It was an almost jest of an attack, using a feint before a counter and a thrust. "Sounds amusing," Silas said. "But of Kalak, did you ever learn of what happened? Anything? I know they all fell, but we heard rumors that they fought Itsu." Rooks thought to himself, and what he knew of their final moments, what they had seen from Calic's blade, and the memories tied to it. Then the soul tie that those who trained as blades placed into their swords. Even beyond the grasp of their owners, the sword took some of the soul of the wielder. He knew that such information would not be of harm at this point. It was not very clear, Rook said, but Master Or saw Calic don armor and dive through a portal against hundreds of Itsu demons. He took down several before he was stricken, and the memory faded. He died as a blade should, then? More than most, my child. Silas nodded. I will make him proud and join him in the eternal halls of Urlas. The young blade smiled as he sipped his tea. Rook swallowed a sick feeling in his stomach. He did not wish death on any of his apprentices, but the truth was, it was upon all of them, and he knew it. Beneath the many stars, he felt the presence of their life force as a unified beating power, and he knew that ahead was nothing but death. His only solace was that he could die in place of some of the others, for that was the point of the elders, to die so that the children did not have to. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They had traveled for many more hours, following Hour's guidance, when they saw another set of ships in the distance. At first, there was a call to arms, but then the other ships launched a bright white rocket that shot up into the sky and burst. It was dwarven dust and not an attack. While there were less than half in number of ships compared to Urlas, they were filled with rows of armored dwarves. Oar, Elor, and Rooks's ships turned course and met up with their leader, as it seemed the god of the sea had blessed them with calm waters for the time. Imagine my surprise, a massive dwarf shouted, when I see Urlas banners. Your name, dwarf? Elor said. A mouthful, he said back. Well, that's my name back home at the tavern. Ha! I'm Naral, Lord of Blackhall and a guest of Haradar. Well, when they decided to let me in, been to a lot of places. More so, I'm a faithful follower of the most folliest of folly in the celestial realm. Are you drunk, Master Dwarf? Aur shouted. Always a bit, but that's not the point. Throka has called to us in our stupor, and I gathered up 200 of my friends to answer that call. Dastard bastards growing in the north, and in an inebriated slurry of choices, we grabbed our armor and weapons and, well, here we are. We went north until we saw a line of flags, and lo, it's Urlas, all here and alone. What is the game? The game is no game, Rook said. Urlas was attacked. We go to the northern void gate. Beautiful. Well, we're going too. Now care for a barrel of ale, or do we have a bit of hacking ahead? Hacking, Rook said. Do you have a heading? Naral asked. We have a head, and it provides such information, Or said, lifting the head on his staff. Well, that's creepy. We shall follow, but keep the weird head to yourself. We'll save the barrels for after the hacking, then. Can we really trust dwarves? Silas asked Rooks. Rooks looked to Or on the other ship as it began to pull ahead again, and to Master Ilor aboard his own vessel, who had turned his attention away from the dwarves. Rooks nodded, looking behind them as the dwarven ships followed in suit behind him. Allies in necessity. It's always been the way of elves and dwarves, he told him. I can say that in the Orc Wars, it wasn't uncommon for dwarven lines to hold fast, using their superior armor and stoutness against the waves of our enemy. We blades would go along the wings of battle lines and take out the banner wielders, and then the blood filth, officers in the old orc armies. It was quite a merry joining of powers, to be honest. Orcs, Silas said. That'd be nice. I feel like we'd know what we were up against in that fight. Orcs were something. He lay there staring across the oceans and falling into a dream, or so he felt. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Rooks! Rooks! Rook slid in place. His Urlas blade in hand, he looked toward the elf shouting his name. Jalin, father of Taslun, Keelan, Alri, and Calic, was atop a mound of orc bodies. Black blood covered his right arm and the hilt of his blade. His fair face was caked in mud, and with stars on his brow shining bright in the smoky sky, he lifted his blade with streaming red flames. "We are to advance to the summit of Demonhead. I've got word. Salmark and Feekmark have the orcs broke and fleeing into the tunnels, but the Bloodfilth are preparing to counterattack from the north." "Hammer Song!" a dwarf shouted. There was a thunderous clamor, and dozens of orcs were splashed like a stone striking a river as the Hammer Song of Micronach advanced hard up the line. The golden hue of their signature hammers in the dust were like sirens upon a dark ocean. The enemies swarmed them, but only to be pulverized one after another. "Blades, let's wreck them! Together! Now!" The dwarven horns sounded, and Rooks and Jalen advanced together. While a regiment of blades rushed to protect the dwarven flank advancing upward, Jalen and Rooks followed the dwarves. The road ahead, though covered in orcs, had a narrow rocky wall where orc archers plinked the dwarves from afar. 2 arrows flew toward Rooks, and he parried both before leaping up to the rocky face, pushing toward a narrow gap in the wall. He sprinted, hopping from stone to stone until he could see the yellow-eyed, crooked face of an orc growling and pointing at him. He swung down, splitting open the orc from forehead to groin, before bringing his blade in a wide swathe and sprinting as fast as he could. Splitting open muscle and thin skin, severing arteries and tracheae, Rooks left a trail of dead and dying orc archers. He looked down below him to see a trio of trolls, but he no more than went to jump down when Jalen and a Hammer Song toppled 2 and sent the third into a defensive retreat. Rooks aimed and leaped. Like an arrow, he spun his blade and flung it at the troll, catching it in the face. Then, swinging onto the troll's neck, he forced it onto its back. The troll grabbed at the Urlas blade, its hands burning as it grabbed at the blade. His body bucked and seized as blood pooled up around the weapon, and then he was still. Rooks reclaimed his sword. "That's one way to kill a troll," Jalen said. As the Hammer Song continued pushing up the mountain, the one who had shouted before and had helped Jalen stood with his hands on the head of his weapon, laughing. "Blades of Urlas," the Hammer Song pointed. "Glad you're both on our side." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. "Hail Wura! Hail Etha!" a voice shouted. Rooks opened his eyes to see the dark sky above, ribboned with not only red and green light undulating above them, but also thousands of stars racing across the skies. Now, as the winds died down, he could hear the elves aboard the other ships singing. He and the others on his ship joined in. Forever vast of starry shrouds, Etha's garden flows above, and with the shimmering it shows the realm, and too a goddess's love. Elves of Urlas, light divine, forever strong beneath ruinite shine, holy holies beyond darkening shrouds. In time, unending, our days divine. Rooks felt the necklace around his neck. "I don't feel I ever trusted you, though you were a source of infinite wisdom and comfort for many, many of my people. I have always felt myself distanced. Though I put little into the sacredness of one person or thing, I have always trusted the blades beside me more than most. I have taught every single one of my students as I believe, and I have always been loyal to Urlas. My anger in recent years has grown, and even a few nights ago I did not trust the path you put us on, but now I understand that this path is not one that you expected in fullness. You may have been a seer and could see beyond, yet you could not see your own end. I will do what is necessary to protect Urlas in your absence." Part 4. The White Plains. Now dawn returned, but the sun only just crossed the horizon, bleeding light of orange and red before returning to its resting place. They were coming to the northernmost reaches, and here were massive towers of stone on isolated craggy islands all across the expanses, feeding a trail of bright blue and glowing mists into the skies. The ships came to a great shoreline that stretched out as far as they could see in either direction. While the elven ships could utilize their narrow bows to get up nearly to the beach, the dwarven ships anchored further out. The sky here was, in a simple word, wrong. The clouds swirled at random, and gusts of winds wore into the surf. As the forces of Urlas formed up on the beaches, Rooks met with the other masters and the one dwarf lord. The way to the gateway is unbalanced. We must work quickly. The Void Gate is accessible via a temple at the furthest northern point of our world, Or said, but it required a Dwemhar to access. We are a bit low on sparkly boys and girls too, Naral said. It was only a rumor the Rooses could open it, Or said. Well, I don't see either in this cursed lot, Naral said. What is your plan? Rooks asked. Get to the temple, figure out a way in. Kill anything that gets in our way. I like it. Simple as a dwarf high on shrooms and tilted ale. Naral laughed. I recommend Master Elor comes with us, and Master Ulgin, Truer, and Del remain with the forces on the beach, Or said. I shall direct a handful of Archons to remain as well. Most all blades who were willing were enchanted and allowed ward creation, amongst other spells. But we have substantial moonstones to ensure Archons retain their powers. And we will just wait? Ulgin asked. We do not know what is ahead, Elor said. I would rather our forces be held in reserve. If we do not return, I advise the forces of Urlas make a choice that brings honor to our creed. Furthermore, your location while upon the White Plains is irrelevant. Once the Void Gate is accessed, you shall be brought as one force to the Starry Shroud, a place of battles of eons ago. Wait upon the beach, and as you do, prepare, Or told them. Now let all know, Elor said to those assembled, that I go forward with the Blademaster, the High Archon, and a Lord of the Dwarves to a sanctum of the old world, but it is all of Urlas and the living realm itself at stake. If we do not bring balance to this place once again, I fear no other may be able to stop the darkness here. Rooks listened to his brother-in-arms, and in his opinion, he had always respected him, but saw him as a bit of a coward. It was a staunch insult to a fellow blade, but Elor was much, much older than Rooks, and that was where the issue was. He had not left Urlas. He had not fought in the Orc Wars. He had not done much of anything of regard by Urlas standards, or even the standards of mortal men. Most heroes and heroines of Urlas had done great things, but also reached their perfection in battle, ceding life for the beyond. To be so old in Urlas was a rarity that drew a level of criticism, if one was being honest with themselves, and a millennia ago would have drawn attention, but Urlas lacked one thing now, and the eldest of the High Elves were dead. Elor was one of the last. As the armies and allies of Urlas made camp, the companions to cross the plains departed. They followed Oaur, who still had the necromancer's skull on the end of his staff, though the line connecting it was not straight as before and twisted wildly. The ground was like that of a fall field, the grass short. The ground was frozen, but by some power this grass still grew, though it was glowing and seemed to even shift color based on the polar lights above them. Fine steel, Blademaster, Naral said, admiring his armor. Ruinite and a bit of mithril, Rook said. I noticed, though the sheen it gets from starlight tells me you've got an enchantment on it. It was a gift from my father. He wore it every day of his life until his last. I do not know of any enchantment other than it did not stop the arrow that struck the back of his neck. It is such in battle, Naral said. You were one of the ones that fought at Demon Head, weren't you? You were there? 1st Regiment of Harkinock. We made the path across the River Vidyu with Sailmark's forces and pushed them into the pits. But you and the Micronock Hammersong took the top, right? That was an empty ale barrel of a mess. Rooks thought back and smiled. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The smell of the orc forces was atrocious. Crooked spears and arrows rained down upon them. Rooks dodged left and right before taking cover behind the dwarven shield wall. Hammers high! The Hammersong shouted. The dwarves split every 2 shields, and the Hammersong charged forward, their hammers spinning above them. With the barrage now focused on the attacking hammer song, their hammers broke the flung weapons, and dwarf horns sounded. Jalin and Rooks darted between the dwarven lines, and sprinting ahead of even the hammer song, they led the charge up to the summit of Demon Head. Now, leaping over the wooden battlements of the orc stronghold, they caught two trolls by surprise and looked over at a broodmother, a matriarch of the orcs in both rank and purpose. Still, she had infant orcs hanging from her body, as while any orcs were grown in pits, those destined for the blood filth would be incubated as such. She snarled, and standing 2 times the height of any normal form, she ran at them with elongated arms and sharp claws. Even before she was upon the 2 blades, the egg sacs on her waist burst, and tiny infantile orcs scurried toward them like elven war-wolves released from their handler. Rooks jumped upon the first one, squishing it beneath his boot as he brought his blade to bear in fast slashes beneath him at 2 more. He jumped upward, feinting a high strike to the broodmother before dropping low and slashing at her waist. She turned, swiping at him and scratching his armor. But Jalin followed just after, severing one of her arms and sending an arterial fountain of black blood threading in gushing streams. "Elven filth!" she screamed, now recoiling as other orcs came upon them. Then arrows flew into them as Sailmark archers breached from the other direction. The matriarch went for one of the buildings as orcs swarmed out, protecting her. "Kill that fat bitch!" a hammer song shouted, coming in from the other side. This dwarf was Master Telnor, and this hammer song was no stranger to Rooks. Jalin and Rooks pushed in, trying to reach the broodmother, but she had gone underground. Horns sounded again, this time with many short bursts. "We've taken Demon Head! We've taken their stronghold!" the dwarves shouted. Now, elves and dwarves had taken the summit, but the fight was far from over. They had to kill the matriarch, and being that they were the closest blades, Jalin and Rooks took it upon themselves to make it their task this night. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They were far from the shores now. The wind pressed against them from ahead, but then would shift, twisting at their legs before pulling them right or left. Snow fell in sheets and then would melt, forming streams of ice before, in a strange shift of sense, the ground became barren like plain black stone. The companions were silent as the archons on their flanks, who had started off keeping some distance from the others in a sort of defensive stance, were now walking just beside them. Beyond their tiny presence in the vast white plains, it seemed that their reality was distorted to just exist where they were, and beyond that was absolute chaos. Rooks noticed the clouds above had broken, and though the winds and snow continued as before, there was a distinct peace upon them, or at the very least, if not peace, an understanding that their path was purposeful and correct. Sometimes such a thing was all one needed to keep trudging on, even when surrounded by chaos. Then, in the skies high above, Rook spotted massive serpent-like entities with glowing orange jewels on their backs. Waur stopped them and looked up, staring in what Rooks could only describe as worried curiosity. "I have never seen such a creation," he said aloud, "but I see what we seek." Ahead now was a flowing silver structure that was only just visible with constant focus, but as they drew nearer, Rooks could make out the long and flowing structure that looked like waves on the horizon. As they came closer and closer, he saw massive towers that reached up to what seemed the top of the world itself. Beyond the towers was a strange orb suspended by swirling silver light, and it was here that the fate of Urlas and the living realm would be decided. Part 5. Void Gate. "What kind of architecture is this?" Neral questioned. They had come up to 3 massive fountains, flowing with a glowing blue water. Atop each fountain, like crowns on a sculpture, were floating stones forming different phases of the moon. "Dwemhar or something before," Orr said. The first thing Rooks noticed was that as they left the White Plains and entered the structure grounds themselves, There was a distinct change in the air and no wind. Yet there was the sound of wind and a melodic ringing, as if the structure itself had its own sound. The Archons seemed to feel something, as they all reacted at the same time. Or looked at them and then to Rooks and Elor. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "feel the pure essence of infantile magic. We are at a grand source. If need arises, we shall not thirst to restore our essence. We are healed of all maladies, as here and now any lack of vigor flees our bodies." Rooks could feel that. Though he'd had little sleep and had journeyed further in the past day than he had in some time, he was not tired at all now. Elor led them up a flight of stairs to a circular platform of stone. Here there were massive archways, and between each sheen stone arch were portals of shimmering stars with wisping energy coming from them. "We are in the antechamber," Elor said. Rooks noticed chests off to the far right of the platform, as well as many blacksmithing tools. "Get a bit of work done here, I guess," Naral said. Rooks went over and glanced at the abandoned work area. "No," he said. "This place and everything about it." He looked to the others and then up to the sky. This was for preparing before entering the way to the Void Gate itself. These sharpening stones once worked Dwemhar blades. Naral went over to one of them and tried to lift it. "Oh, break me over a stone," he said as he grimaced. "That's heavy. I won't be taking any goodies, I guess." Aur tapped his staff and brought up a glowing wheel of different runes. He began to layer spells upon himself. The other Archons did the same. After several spells, Aur turned to Elor and Rooks. "Wards of protection," he said. Rooks closed his eyes as Aur cast his magic, feeling a warm sensation overtaking his arms and legs. Then, across his armor, he could feel brimming energy that was near palpable, causing a cold sensation in his fingertips. "What is this?" he asked him. "Oh, that?" Aur said. "That's a vitality container. If you or anyone else is hit with a spirit attack, it'll block it. Well, it'll block it once." "Spirit?" Naral asked. "The last threat to our realm was Itsu demons. We should expect the same here." Now prepared, they waited for Aur's leadership. He was the Master Archon of Urlas, and as such, this was more his specialty than Elor's. "We follow you into the realm of the Void Gate," Elor said. The Urlas blade stood with the Archon and the Dwarf Lord. Aur turned and took a deep breath. The other Archons prepared themselves, looking to their master and standing just behind him. Rooks walked up beside him. "We are with you, friend, always." Aur did not move. Rooks slowly looked around to Aur's face and found that his teeth were clenched and his eyes were twitching. "Rooks?" he asked. Aur could not move anything but his eyes, and Rooks followed their glare. It was to his staff and the head upon it. The eyes in the head of the necromancer became alight. A sickening feeling filled Rooks as he tried to bring his blade about to strike the head, but he felt a shuddering push flow from it. He stumbled and looked back at Elor, Naral, and the Archons. "Archons, your master's staff is taken! Purify!" The Archons jumped forward, casting purging spells and layering white, but Aur's staff ripped away from him, flying upward with the head still bound to the top of the staff. Bolts of energy struck the ground all around them as Aur fell to the ground. Then the staff flew into one of the portals. Rooks ran to Aur as the Archons headed one after another into the portal. My staff! My staff!" Aur said. "It has led us here. The force driving it is not gone, but Vanku himself. We must hurry." Aur pushed himself up and Rooks away, sprinting after his fellow Archons. Rooks looked to Elor. "For Urlas, master, and for the living realm." "And for good ale, good women, and all the greatest of dwarves," Naral shouted. The companions of Urlas charged into the portals. Rooks felt as if he had jumped into a pool of water, and then emerging on the other side, he saw a massive black wall made of sparkling light. Slender trees flanked a towering black gate made of silver. Here, there was a distinct red orb bursting through the center of the gate itself. From within the gate were tendrils of black, orange, and red, all twisting into the gate itself as a massive bulge expanding outward. Or's staff flew toward it, but his archons worked quickly, casting a barrage of white spells that spun about, gripping the staff. They pulled the staff downward, and Or ran for it. After he reclaimed it, a massive form tied to the skull of the necromancer took form. A gargantuan beast of bone and tissue appeared wreathed in black fire. "I am the master," it quaked, its voice booming with an echoing shrill that caused Rook's ears to ache. "Blademaster, with me!" Elor said. The two blades jumped forward as a thundering clap was followed by the entire void gate shaking. A massive crack appeared, and black serpentine creatures flowed through and over them before vanishing beyond their sight. "Archons! Archons! Bind the gate! Seal the crack! Our enemy pushes through!" Aur shouted. The Archons went to work, casting layering silver spells over the door, as now Aur floated above all of them, forming multiple circular envelopments. "We are upon the starry shroud. I call to those who wait," Aur said. "Send with all haste the warriors of the living realm. Let us not fall into the darkness." Rooks looked beneath him as the ground appeared as grassy fields. The gate behind him throbbed strangely, and more of the black forms erupted out. The massive creature ran for the gate. Rooks watched as the creature began to glow brighter and brighter before exploding. The wave of energy flowed over them like a tsunami of undulating forms. Aur summoned a massive ward, shielding them. Now the creature was gone, but the gate wall was falling apart. "It was a trap, the skull that led us here. I was a fool. I must seal it back. It is like a leaking dam with outflows of that which is beyond it." Ahead, hundreds if not thousands of creatures that had no discernible forms took form from the black shrouds flowing from the gate. "They're surrounding us!" Neral shouted. "Let not stand alone those who fight beneath the void gate!" Elor shouted. "We are Urlas, last of the ancient high elves! Feel our fury!" Rooks took a guarded stance, sliding his foot back as a great white circle expanded out beneath their feet. It was an Archon defensive spell. Now, the Archons were in a circle with Or above them. Elor was on the point of a triangular defense, with Rooks on the lower point and Neral on the opposite point from him. "Where are our armies?" Elor shouted. One by one, blades of Urlas appeared, and Rooks shouted commands. "Urlas, hold your ground!" Their enemy slammed into them, and it was not at all like fighting orcs or any other foe, but yet like standing in a river of angry rocks and vines as tendrils of bone struck and snaked through their guards. Rooks felt several slashes across his face until he could see in the shroud ahead a pulsating black core that glimmered with a faint glow. He swung his blade, blasting back the tendrils before flipping forward and thrusting his blade. He stabbed it, and it shattered, sending up an explosive wave of energy. Then it flew directly at him. He felt his protective ward block the spiritual blast, and he fell back to see multiple blades all become as phantoms, their swords clanging on the ground. Or expanded the ward. "Rooks, stay within the circle. These foes are not of what I know. It is something else." His voice was clear, yet Or was high above them, summoning up tornadoes of lightning before spinning about and electrifying everything. More blades and Archons were coming, appearing one after another, but many of them were not as they should have been. Their armor was aflame, and some of the dwarves appeared half-frozen. "What is this?" Neral shouted, his hammer held high but pausing as multiple of his kin fell dead beside him, filled with spikes of ice. "Where is the enemy?" the dwarf bellowed. Then a scissoring blade came down upon the dwarf, and his head was shredded from his neck. A towering silver foe that appeared as slivers of crystal broke straight through the ward, cutting down multiple archons. Elor charged forward with blades, and they were upon the creature, toppling it from above with a furious series of slashing blows. The creature fell, and the gate rumbled again. The crack grew larger, and Oar flew toward it, striking it with his staff. The gate swung open, and serpents flew toward them before diving. Elor charged forward as dozens of the creatures like before materialized in the shrouds of light emerging from the gate. He looked back. "Blades of Urlas with me now. We are called for glory." Elor turned to parry a foe just before him, only to be immediately severed into two parts by a massive blade, his body crumbling as his organs and fluids turned into a hazy mist. The blades fell back with their swords and guards, parrying multiple blows and attempting to hack back, but their futile defense was failing. The void gate was broken. "The gate!" an archon shouted. "Master!" Or flew back toward them as he looked to his fellow archons. "We have no choice, children. Come to me now. Rooks! Orb formations! Orb formations!" Rooks fell into a defensive circle with the other blades, retreating to the center of the ward. Their enemy was just about to envelop them. The archons went to their master, and Or suddenly surged in size many times that of his normal form. He began to glow bright gold, and one by one the staffs of the other archons merged into his. "We invoke the power of Urlas High," Or's voice shouted, echoing around Rooks. "Ether, be our guidance. Seal that which is of the void." Each archon lifted their hands and shined forth as tiny flames before they became as parchment flowing around Or. Their bodies faded away, and thousands of runes expanded from him. Or looked at the blades and dwarves, reaching out with one hand and encasing them in a crystal ward. "There are so few of us. So few of us have come. Where are my brothers and sisters of Urlas? Where are the dwarves?" Or, suddenly a great swordsmith engulfed the void gate in a bright flame flowing from his body. The doors slammed back shut, then back open, then shut again. Or cast out many concentric circles, turning their enemy back and sending out a massive shimmering white wave as Or became as nothing but spinning energy. When Rooks could see again, Or had shrunk back to his normal size and lay on the grassy field, surrounded by the many staffs and robes of his order. The gate was glowing and slowly shutting. There was an obvious flow of energy from Or still, as if he was healing the gate. Rooks ran for him, taking his friend in his arms. Or grabbed at him in a panic. I tried, but there are too many that have escaped," he said, choking. "No, our enemy is defeated. Even still you shut the gate. I only slowed it. Something beyond us, and even the Itsu. It isn't them. It is..." He coughed, and blood flowed from his mouth. I don't know if we did enough. I did what I could to protect you, Blademaster. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They had descended into the orc pits, and even now they could hear water flowing into the caverns around them. It was the final moments of the orc war, and pressed against the cavern walls, they could only move forward into the pits. The passage behind them had caved in, and while they had heard the horn calls to fall back, they could not. Their only escape was ahead. The orcs were in a frantic retreat, but as the Urlas blades in their hands cast a dark red glow, the two blades were ever more zealous. Now, pressed into another chamber where multiple honeycomb passages were before them, the orcs became frantic. Several dropped their weapons and grabbed for their legs as others climbed the walls. "Spin! Spin!" Jalin shouted. Two of them began moving in circles, spinning their blades and catching the ground on fire as their momentum grew and grew. In unison, they sliced their foes and forced the bold to fall back, and the stupid took their fill of elven craftsmanship to their faces. The orcs had fallen back again. "Water is coming in fast," Jalin said. "We don't have long." And she'll try to escape too, Rook said. What do you think? They looked at several passages they could take. As Telnor said, fat bitch. He pointed at the largest of the passages. It went upward at a strange angle. Think she could make it with only one arm? Well, she didn't go down the smaller ones. It wasn't easy, but using their blades to climb into the chasm, they then began a careful and strenuous climb. Rook's back was against the rock, and to say it was absolute pain was an understatement. Sometimes I wonder how we get into these spots, he said. Jalin laughed. Just think of the stories we can tell our kids. Oh, I'm thinking of them. I'm just hoping I can get out of here in the first place. Now, I won't let the broodmother eat you, he joked. Rooks looked down. He could see water flowing in the passage below. More the water I worry of. The plan of the allied forces was working, and the orc caverns were fast filling with water. But their foe was ahead. Now they reached the top of the cavern, and ahead with a trail of entrails was their prize. The broodmother bled profusely with several egg sacs split open, and as it was, they could see orc shamans ahead. There was a large green fire on an arched rock. The shamans wore elaborate headdresses and were the religious order that, in Rooks's opinion, were the salvation for the broodmother. They were in the middle of some type of spell that could be a portal, from what they could tell. Greetings, Jalin shouted. The broodmother turned, and the shamans pointed before aiming their staffs at the two elves. A flurry of fireballs flew toward them. Rooks leaped to the right as the ground where they had been exploded in fire and rippling energy. Rooks was engaged with multiple orcs, slashing wide and high. Rooks went for the shamans. Both of them pointed their staffs at him, and he focused his gaze, seeing the edges of the undulating energy at the center of the incoming fireballs. He parried just at the right moment, cutting into the orb of energy, and using his Urlas blade, he focused his sword's own magic to counter the spell. Deflecting them to either side, he broke through an explosion of rock to engage the first shaman. It used its staff to parry him, then threw a small potion at him center of mass. It exploded, sending an enveloping gas that clouded his vision. He swung and missed as the second shaman jumped on his back. He grabbed up, managing to get his hands on the creature's neck, and slammed him into the rock before him. He felt several of its teeth break from its mouth, but it snapped at him still. Rook slammed it over and over before he felt a sharp prick in his upper shoulder just under his armor. He pushed off, backing up, leaving the quivering orc now bleeding out as the first shaman had thrust him just right with a spear. He pulled the spear from his chest and saw several more fireballs coming his way. There was so much smoke, and he still couldn't see fully. Glass shattered nearby, and a swarm of bees flew toward him. "Damn shamans!" Jalin shouted, and then the broodmother screamed. Then, in an explosion of energy that forced Rook's back, the air was cleared, and Master Orr appeared. "By the light of Ether, Scourge!" The shamans rolled across the floor, and the orcs still able fled. Rooks engaged the shamans, killing each with thrusts of his blade, as Jalin and Rooks lifted their swords at the broodmother. But O'Aur was already fully engaged. He pressed the broodmother against the wall. "You are finished," he said. He thrust his staff forward, and she was engulfed in white fire, her newest orc children boiling in her waist pouches and falling lifeless before she too burst from within and slid lifeless on the ground. Orr said. "Where'd you come from?" Jalin asked. "Oh, places. Busy us Archons. But a few wayward blades chasing a broodmother? Well, I knew you two were having far too much fun. Come now, the tunnels are filling. Let us return to the surface. How are you going to get out, now that I question it?" Rooks and Jalin looked at one another. "Well," Jalin began. "Yes, Blades, indeed. All about that fight, but not fully thinking it through. Do not fear, dear Blades. I am always here to help you when you need it." Rook smiled at his sarcasm as Jalen shrugged. They had beaten the Orc Scourge. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Master Orr's grip lessened on Rook's hand, and he looked up at the closing void gate. It sealed. He looked at the remaining other blades and a single dwarf. As he went to speak, in a sudden eruption, the clouds far above them shifted and blasted outward. He could hear ethereal screams and howls. The very clouds seemed to snap at him with gnashing teeth. He felt the coldness of a dozen winters at once, and then nothing. Part 6. Thrashing. Rook was face down in the snow. His body tingled. He pushed up to see a single line of defense in the form of multiple blades and at least 2 dwarves. They were disheveled, to say the least. "Watch for the dragon!" a voice shouted. He had barely gotten the words out when a shattering blast of icy white from the dark clouds above streaked through the lines. Rook tried to make sense of the scenes of chaos before him. While some of their kin had come to the Void Gate, their enemy had struck them in this realm too. "Who is in command?" he shouted. The elves looked toward him, and he spotted his apprentice. He was pulling an injured dwarf toward a line of their kin. Rook ran over as Archon's spells flew across the sky in the distance. They landed in the darkness, sending up blasts of red and orange, yet a deep fog had covered the land. As he reached Silas, he took hold of the dwarf by the other hand. He noticed the dwarf wasn't conscious. "Master Rooks," Silas said, "they attacked us before we heard any call to battle from you or the others." "What happened here? Who attacked? Where did the dragon come from?" "Black beasts, beings of spirit and fire. Do not become too still or the dead things grab you." "Look," he said, nodding behind Rook. Rook turned to see a massive black form dropping out of the clouds and grasping the bodies of dead elves. "What is that?" he asked aloud. "Master, many of our kin are dead by the beaches. We were trying to reach higher ground, but our enemy uses their wings to swipe us any time we gather up for too long." They dragged the dwarf to a single Archon working on multiple elves already. "Master," the Archon said, "where is Master Orr?" "Fallen. All who went have fallen except myself, I think. We were brought back to this realm in a storm of energy within the void." "Is it shut, Blademaster?" another elf asked. The Archon placed his hand over the dwarf on the ground. "It is, but our enemy is great," Rook told them. "This one is dead," the Archon said. Silas knelt for a moment and released the dwarf's hand. "I tried, brother," he said. "That dragon is going to be back." "We need to get out of here," a blade said. "We await your command," Silas said. "Master Dell went with a host of our brothers and sisters to try to reach you when we were attacked. He never came back." "We make for the ocean. Sound horns, brothers. We must reform if we can, and whatever this enemy is can have this barren place. With the Void Gate shut, we must fall back to Urlas. Our task here is done, but our enemy has us in a broken state. I fear futility in any action to do as our enemy wants." "We retreat?" Silas asked. Rook nodded. "Retreating in our blade work is simply taking a step back to prepare for a counterattack, right?" Silas nodded. "Good. Now, Blades of Urlas, do not leave any of our brothers behind. Let's move." They gathered the injured, and the companions of Blades went south. Moving up a slight hill, Rook could better survey some of what had happened. Walls of ice in long strands had shredded their gathered forces. While it seemed that the remaining masters of the High Council had tried to attack the force that came first, most of their armies were dead. They came across more injured, but many more dead. Now, other blades could see their gathering force and made their way to join the host. Soon their numbers were over 50 standing, with many more carried, but they were slower now. "Blades, defensive lines. Watch our flanks," Rook said. He led near the front with Silas near him. The wind had shifted, and he could smell the ocean. We're getting close. But it was just at that moment he heard the flapping of wings in the clouds above. The Archon with them summoned a ward just in time, deflecting an icy blast. "Blades, blades now!" Silas and several others spun their swords, summoning energy and feeding it into the defensive spell. This was the newest technique, the enchantment Oor had wanted for blade swords. The ward grew brighter and larger, encompassing the host as every part of the ward fell under attack. The Archon stomped his foot, throwing his staff up and lifting the ward before catching the staff and slamming it down. A rippling eruption of energy overtook the ward, and the attackers fell dead. Then, blacked forms with red eyes stared out from the fogs around them. They began to line up in a mass between them and the unseen beaches beyond. "Blades of Urlas, let shine your swords!" Rooks shouted. "Our enemy is before us, above us, and behind us. Let them try to flee our wrath. With me now, glory awaits beyond these foes." Horns sounded, and Rooks burst forward with sword held high. Faster and faster he gained more speed, and beside him his last apprentice Silas raised his sword in a similar fashion. Their enemy responded, lunging out with curved spears, only to meet parries and counters of varying kinds. The blades engaged the spectral foe, and with shimmering starlight they left glowing swaths in their enemies. Rooks engaged with one, only to feel the shaman's necklace seemingly pull him to the right. He sidestepped just to miss a sudden eruption of dark lightning. He looked for its source, spotting a tall figure with an elongated head. It stalked behind the line of their primary enemy. Rooks shoved his way between two of their foes, bringing his blade up to a mid-guard just to find that his target, the strange caster, broke all the bodies of the foes between Rooks and itself. Then, summoning them into itself, it grew in height. "Master, together!" Silas said. Then came two more blades. The four of them circled the creature. "Go back to the void!" Silas shouted. The creature laughed. "I am the void, infant." It summoned a spell around its fingers, and Rooks made a leaping strike, nearly severing one of the hands. He landed on his feet, spun about, and swung hard at the creature's hand as it tried to slash him. It caught his sword. "The light of Urlas fades," it said, gripping the blade. The ruinite fire running up and down the blade began to falter. But then, the other blades were upon it. Silas made a low slash, severing its right leg as both of the other blades went high. They landed atop the creature, thrusting their swords into its chest. The creature spun about, gimped by the loss of its leg, but nonetheless dangerous. Its ribcage expanded, gripping both of the blades and drawing them into itself. They both screamed as their bodies were torn apart, their flesh dripping off their bones as they were fused into the creature. It released Rooks's sword, and he fell into a guarded stance. "Silas, stay back!" Rooks shouted. The creature took hold of both of the Urlas swords and lifted them. Now the Archon had joined them. She sent a series of curling lightning bolts around the creature, only for it to use the blades as almost a net, catching the spells in a focused bolt. It ran at her. The Archon flipped the end of her staff up, casting a wide spell of searing flames out in a cone. It broke through the spell and engulfed her in the contained lightning, and her screams wailed over the icy ground. As the creature tormented her, Rooks and Silas attacked, both making passing slashes and breaking off to the right and left. The creature turned, nearly striking Silas. Rooks jumped and then lunged, hitting the creature's center of mass in the stomach. It counterattacked, and Rooks parried. Parrying, then disengaging, making for another attack point before he was countered hard again. The creature beat his sword back, and Rooks leaned in, using the momentum to swing hard, spinning about and making multiple slashes on the creature from its legs up to its face. Then, the creature got lucky, landing a strike on the back of Rooks's leg and shredding part of his calf muscle. He fell to the ground. The Archon made it to her knees. Her face was burned black, and her bones dripped with flesh partially ripped from her body. "Ether's light!" she screamed. From her staff burst forth a light so grand that Rook's had to shield his eyes. The creature before them screeched, and then the light was gone. The Archon was dead, lying in a pool of fluids, but the creature was stunned. Its entire form was bathed in a sizzling white light. Rook's struggled to stand. It was difficult to do so, but though he was bleeding, his zeal remained. "Now, master," Silas said. Rook's forced himself forward. His leg ached horribly with searing pain, but still he ran with the young blade, both of them leaping onto the beast and thrusting their blades into its form. Rook's felt the creature shift, and he and his blade were pushed away with a blast of energy. The white light upon it was gone. The creature grabbed Silas, and the blade squirmed in its grasp. "For Urlas!" he shouted. Silas took his sword in two hands, thrusting it into the face of the creature, breaking off a piece of its elongated skull. Then he swung again just as the creature bit forward, crunching into his arm and sword. Silas let out a shuddering scream as blood shot up from his torn limb. "Master! Master!" he cried. But the creature took the other sword in its hand before Rook's could act and thrust it into Silas. Rook's screamed a battle cry, running at his foe and jumping at it. The creature attempted to hit him with Silas's body, but Rook's was already upon him. With a keen strike of pure rage, he broke through the flesh and bone form of whatever it was the creature was made of. He broke it in half, and the figure, and he fell to the ground. Rook stood up with the corpse of his foe around him to find it was dead. He looked back to see Silas with his eyes open but fixed on the sky above. He went to him, leaning at his side as the battle faded away from them both. Silas's eyes traced to him, and then his breathing ceased. "My blade, I will not forget you," Rook said. Where the others were now, he didn't know. The rolling fogs covered the battlefield, and he no longer heard the clang of battle or the screams of his kinsmen. Now, though, he saw strange black beasts with red eyes running in packs in the distance. "I am alone." As he slid in viscous, pulled blood, breaking up the snow and ice beneath his feet, he made for the high ground ahead of him. He had to be nearly to the beaches. Still, his injury to his leg was bleeding a lot. The wind and speckles of ice flew around him in a swirl as he heard a shriek. He swung upward with his sword. Nothing. He stopped to catch his breath, his head pivoting left and right as he checked another one for any signs of life. He pressed his fingers against the Archon's neck. Another dead. They're all dead. Above, a long and slender black shroud reached down as the polar lights began to ripple high above. The elf fled the spot he was in, knowing if he dwelt too long, the shroud would grasp him. He made it to another point and tore off a few pieces of cloth and bandaged his leg as best he could. "You mustn't run aimlessly. I see you." "I can help," a voice said. "No, Wura cannot help in the realm of Vanku. The very god of death came against Urlas." 3 black beasts formed before him. Their bodies were like black fire, and their eyes a fierce red like a bright burning flames. "I am Rook's!" the elf shouted, "Swordmaster of Urlas, and I will be your bane!" He brought his Urlas blade forward, lunging as he swung up, slashing through the first foe. He felt the others move in the winds as they twisted around him. Rook's countered, bringing his sword up into a mid-guard and spinning, striking both. Their eviscerated forms fell with a crackling sear upon the snow, before becoming as every other being upon the icy tundra, frigid. "Cursed path! All who left Urlas have been cursed to this fate. I told them all," Rook shouted. "I cannot escape this place." But another voice was in his head, a voice that he had not heard in such a way before. Then he felt the necklace about his neck begin to vibrate. "No, Rooks, no. Make for the sea, a ship. The sea shall save you. Urlas still needs its Blademaster." He looked down at the necklace swinging from his neck and saw it was glowing. He had found this back in Urlas before they had departed for the north. "Urlas calls you home," the voice said. What is this? What madness is upon me? Rooks couldn't believe he was hearing a voice and following it. He could not believe he was in the position he was in now. He wanted to find someone, anyone, alive. But now he was surrounded by nothing but death. Why have I been spared when everyone I have taught have fallen? Am I so bad a teacher that those after me could not live? The masters of Urlas are gone. Our armies, every soul who grew up on the shores of Lake Thrashing, have faded away. He ran through the fogs, his enemy fleeing before him without even the use of his sword. Almost as if the fog was breaking before his path, he could now see the open ocean and a lone ship resting against the shoreline. Making it to the water, he fell to his knees. He could not catch his breath. Urlas, forgive me. I was not the Blademaster you needed. He looked back behind him and could see an open expanse where the fogs had fled, and hundreds of bodies lay iced over and broken. He wept. To the ship, Blademaster! Urlas has need of you! The voice from before commanded. He stood up, looking back a last time to the battlefield. The others of Urlas, they are defenseless. I must go to them so they do not suffer the same fate as the others. I must not fail anyone else. Part 7. Blademaster. Alone I return. Alone I leave with no understanding beyond my own eyes, to which I feel deceived. Rooks's ship moved without wind, as if unseen hands propelled him forward. His amulet was still glowing. His body ached as scratches on his skin mixed with forming contusions. He tried to meditate, but he was haunted by nightmares of that which his eyes had seen. All this, and I only wish I were in another time, back with Jalene and the defeat of the Orc Scourge. But this is not that, and all of them are dead now. What madness is it to be in a state of life where every path is spent? There is no more time with those gone, and it feels as if every choice and lack of choice throughout my life has led to this place. Even when I admit my own shortcomings, I find no true solace. I had thought that the death of 3 of my students at once was horrid, but in truth now, even those who had lived become blades, and served both themselves and the greater song of Urlas itself, are gone. Now, I return home, but why have I lived? He sat up in the boat, and his eyes looked at the empty places around him. There was no joyous singing. There was no banter. The only friend he had was the twisting icy winds of the glacial seas and the cracks of the boat moving up and down the rolling waves. The sky was clear. He looked up at the sea of stars flowing above him. Ether, why have you forsaken us? Tears fell from his eyes as he lay back on the deck of the ship. He felt himself falling into a deep sleep as his injuries took their toll and every ounce of resolve and fury to keep him awake faded. Asterisk. Rooks was standing upon the balcony of a city he did not know. The towers were made of crystals. He saw a massive moon over the dunes of a vast desert. A single figure stood staring out beside him. He did not know them, not at first glance. Blademaster, you are injured, she said, but can you still do as Urlas needs? I have given everything for Urlas, he told her. He walked toward the edge of the balcony and looked out at a smoldering city. He felt the woman touch his hand. Your injuries are great, but you will be needed before the end in a way you will not expect. I can heal that of your body, but not your mind. There is only so much others can do for you, after all. He looked over at her, and his breath was taken for a moment. It was Alri, the sister of his fallen apprentices. She wore garb and armor he did not know. He went to speak, but she pressed her fingers against his lips. It is not for you to know every work and answer. I felt a great loss, and as I gazed north, I saw you. Alri, he said, this is a dream. You are all dead, gone. You died. Your brothers died. I have slipped into a greater madness. In a way, I have died, but Urlas remains, Blademaster. You lose hope, and I feel a draw that I have made a terrible choice myself, but we are in the cycle of time in the grace of the great poet together. Every action leads to the destined path, and perhaps wrong choices cannot be avoided, but it is the greater act we must pay attention to. But you have survived? If your old master knew, he would have been ecstatic. He knew before the end, Master Rooks. He surmised all as it truly was and not as it was presented. The shaman, the one we have always seen as a path of wisdom, had a much greater path ahead. You will be a part of it. I wish to be a part of it. Then return to Urlas, Alri. Return to us and your home. She smiled. I have great work to do yet here, and I have made choices I cannot escape now. We seek one you do not know, but of that it is not your worry or charge. Our armies are destroyed, Alri. We have none left to defend Urlas. You have great power. Please do not turn on your people. My people in both elven and Dwemhar lines are my loyalty, and Urlas is not alone. It still has its Blademaster, and in time your old apprentice will surely return. Taslun, he stammered. Kakalak? Keelan? Alri looked at him. The time of Urlas as it was is gone. The path to ascension is ahead. Now waken and protect those of Urlas. She touched him on the head, and his eyes sprang open. He saw the encircling mountains of Urlas above him, and a fractured red sky above. His body was restored, and any sign of injury was gone. Somehow, Alri had healed him. He was on the shore outside of the actual realm of Urlas. As Rook sat up, he looked around and felt his body. Then, standing, he realized his leg was not as painful as it had been, but it was still difficult to walk as he once had. Looking up at Urlas, he sighed. I am the last master. I must see to the people who remain. The ship that had ferried him back across the ocean was broken. On foot, Rooks left the beaches and journeyed along the riverbank and into Urlas. The trees swayed with the wind as for the first time in known time, Urlas was within the living realm and not its own isolated realm. But the trees still smelled just as sweet. Rooks felt a solemn peace as he returned home, and while in no form did he forget those lost, he felt calmer than he'd expected. Beware. Urlas is not out of danger. The voice had returned, the same voice that had led him before. It'd be nice if you, whoever you are, gave a bit more insight than that. Blademaster, your enemy will soon be upon you without my aid. Rooks drew his sword and kept watch to his sides and behind himself. Whatever or whoever threatened Urlas, he'd engage. But as he quickened his pace beside the shores of Lake Thrashing, he saw nothing over the water or in the woods. The mountains were still, and now there was not even a slight breeze in the air. He had made it to the edge of the lake on the far side from the ocean and headed into High Urlas now. But as he did this, the water began to bubble behind him. Master Rooks! A voice shouted. It was a voice from the Urlas watch, but he didn't see them. Stay back! Rooks shouted. Whoever they were, they'd get in the way. Now, a figure emerged from the depths of Lake Thrashing. It was a dwarf. Their body was engorged with water, and their tissue seemed to nearly be bursting from every seam. It was like someone had taken the broken form of this being and woven them back together. Upon their head was a crown of stone. I am the Watcher of Urlas, entrusted, they said with a raspy voice. I was the king of Gurundothrak, but now Vanku gives me a second life. Rizen, I return to take that as I planned, and eventually all of Urlas will fall beneath me. Entrusted does not mean you destroy something. Your task was a failure before you began. You are a blade. I have been killed before. Your defenders have learned time after time that I return. You are no different from those within High Urlas. Then this should be quite easy for you. The undead dwarf stepped onto the shore. Now, Its body fused with green bolts of energy, and it took a much purer appearance, no longer bloated. Rook slid his foot back and lifted his sword. He took a guarded stance. The dwarf cackled. "In my first life, I was called the Barb King. Now I know true power." The dwarf reached behind his back, pulling out a sickle with a diamond-encrusted handle. With that, he drew out a hand axe too. The two of them stared for a moment, and with a guttural scream, the dwarf ran at Rook's. He saw the feint coming. The dwarf jumped and then landed before ducking and attempting to slash Rook's legs. Seeing it in the dwarf's motion, Rook's jumped higher, bringing his blade beneath him in a slashing motion. He nicked the dwarf, and upon landing, turned to parry the spinning scythe flung at him while his back was turned. He deflected it with a clang, lunging forward and stabbing at the dwarf. The dwarf brought his axe around, parrying the stab and sliding down the blade, nearly taking off Rook's hand. Then the scythe came flinging back, flying toward the Barb King's grasp again. Rook spun his blade, sending out a wave of fire as he fell back to a better position, further from the water. The dwarf slammed both of his weapons together before smashing the ground with the scythe. A rippling wave of rock and dirt shot toward Rook's, and with it, dozens of hands emerged from the ground. Now, undead swarmed him. Though he dispatched each of them with ease, it was the dwarf again, full speed, who struck at him again. He fell back further and into the woods, using the trees to force the dwarf one way or another in his attacks. The clangs and slashes, splintering the trees with every other blow, sent fairies fleeing as the elf and dwarf went back and forth. Twice Rook's landed slashes upon his foe, but it seemed that with every attack, the dwarf became angrier and angrier. Then the dwarf's eyes became bright blue, glowing like torches. "You tire, but you will not fall by just dwarven fury, but also my own hold on the world. You will freeze as did the blades upon the northern void." A screech pierced the air, and bright white and blue tore through the trees from high above as a massive ice dragon was upon Urlas. "Die, Blademaster," the dragon said through the dwarf. But then the voice Rook had heard before spoke to him. "Do not fear this. Destroy the dwarf. The menace will flee. This is a mere test on the path to true enlightenment." "Getting damn tired of hearing voices." Rook saw another wave of undead coming for him. He spun his sword again, catching them on fire before grabbing one of them by the neck. Sending the flaming corpse directly at the dwarf, he then jumped and kicked the Barb King in the face. The dwarf staggered, and though he steadied himself, it took his guard down for a moment, and his face was marred with the sheen ruinite blade of Rook's sword. He split the dwarf's face, cracking through tooth and jaw, and further jarring the dwarf. Rook's kicked again, knocking the dwarf down before a final cleaving strike cut through the top of his skull down to his shoulder. The dwarf stopped moving. He shook, and the magic that had inhabited his body sparked randomly, cutting through the air with a sizzle. Then came dragon ice, shredding wood and sapping the air of warmth. Rook's fled, just dodging the strike, and headed further into the woods. The dragon exploded through the treetops, nearly grasping him with its claws. Rook's heard another blast coming and turned, bringing his blade up as the ice missed, but the dragon struck him with his snout. For a moment, everything slowed around him. He could see a great white river and a black expanse. This was not Urlas at all. Then, strangely, a single elf with his hand up. "It is not time, my master. Live, get up." Rook's looked down and saw a spectral form of his own hand. Then, looking at the figure speaking, he recognized him. "Kalak, but you..." Kalak bowed to him. His clothing was like a cloak of stars. "I am gone, but I have been given other tasks in the second life. Our people do not welcome you to this realm yet, master." "Kalak, I should have never let you go." "Forgive yourself, my master. Forgive and live now, for you hold the fates of many, many more you do not know." Rooks began to feel cold upon his neck, and then with a forceful push with his feet, he left the blackness and the presence of his old apprentice. He gasped and turned to see a growling dragon head just above him. His sword was not in his hand, but he had struck his head upon the stones of the altar and memorial he had for Calic by the water's edge in the woods. He looked up at blade once wielded by his student. "I will fight in honor of you and all others that fell in battle before now. Urlas will stand and fight as long as I can still grasp a blade." He reached up, grabbing the sword and thrusting it with every bit of force into the dragon before him. With a snap of ice and white fog, the dragon fled in a spinning snowdrift and was gone. A few moments passed, and many of Urlas came upon him. He sat up as those who remained of his kin tended to him. Then, in a shock he did not expect, he saw Shaman Iwir standing before him. How can this be?" he shouted. "You were dead!" "I have returned through an ancient power, my faithful Blademaster. I will never leave those of Urlas, but it was with great ill I returned. I was not fast enough to save all who so valiantly fought at the northern void gate." "He shields us and leads us in the darkness," one of High Urlas said. Iwir knelt before Rooks. "By my life, I shall ensure that the sacrifices of the many do not ring without purpose in the coming days. The dragon was defeated, but not destroyed. There is much we must do, but we will do it together. I will do what I can to protect Urlas, but further tribulations come upon us. Will you help me?" Rooks would look to his people and assist Iwir however he could. "Your necklace," Rooks said, taking it off. Iwir took it back. "You are faithful to have led as you did. Now, let us tend to Urlas and plan our path from here." Epilogue. The last stand of Urlas had come and gone, and while survivors remained, it wouldn't be long. Iwir had worked every end to come to this time, and as he returned to his hovel, he kicked at the body left within it, then threw the amulet Rooks had worn at the body. An unwilling sacrifice that allowed the incantation to burst through the Urla's shroud. Then, protecting the one so dear to my child that comes back soon. Yes. He looked back out at High Urlas from his hut. More must fall, a necessary act, and one that finalizes that which was meant to pass. Urlas has been my home for a time, but its purpose is gone. I begin my path toward ascension, for my long-lost Urlas child shall soon return home. He smiled. Finally, all my workings will be realized, and I will have what I have sought for eons.